Happening to the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar seems to be a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, according to the top human rights official for the United Nations. But the government of Myanmar, the mainly Buddhist country formerly known as Burma, says it's been provoked into using military force. The violence began over a fortnight ago after Rohingya militants were accused of attacking police stations in Rakhine State. After the military response, more than 300,000 Rohingya fled to neighbouring Bangladesh, where many are now in a desperate condition. The BBC's Rita Chakrabarti is in the port city of Cox's Bazar, and we can join Rita now for the latest.
Hugh, the landscape here in Cox's Bazar has been transformed in the last 2 weeks with a massive influx of refugees. Among the many services struggling to cope are the hospitals. They are trying to provide the usual services that refugees need, but doctors are saying that they've seen many Rohingya refugees coming to them with gunshot wounds and, as we discovered today, landmine injuries sustained as people were trying to flee the violence at home.
What is happening in Myanmar? Looking across from Bangladesh, huge clouds of smoke fill the sky. Military boats patrol the river border. The army is accused of setting fire to Muslim Rohingya villages and of planting landmines in the paths of fleeing people. It denies that it's targeting civilians. But we've found evidence to suggest otherwise. This small hospital in Cox's Bazar has been coping with large numbers of Rohingya casualties. In the last week, it's had an influx of critically injured people blown up by landmines as they escaped. Azizul Haq is one of them. He's 15 years old and unlikely to make it to 16. He arrived at the hospital a week ago with his legs destroyed. He's suffered a terrible loss of blood, but doctors have no more to give him. His brother in another hospital suffered the same fate.
I can't go back to Myanmar. We are not safe. I will beg here in Bangladesh, and that will be better. I used to pray to Allah to give me a son, but now my sons are gone. Their injuries are so bad, it's as if they are dead. It is better that Allah takes them. They are suffering so much.
Sabikur Nahar will pull through, although she too has lost both her legs. She fled Myanmar because she says the military had been targeting her community. She was crossing the border with her 3 sons when she trod on a landmine.
They had already gone ahead and I was behind them. And that's when the explosion happened. We'd been fired on, shot at, and they planted mines. We have escaped to Bangladesh because we have nowhere else to go.
5-year-old Jahura plays with her little brother. She was shot whilst being carried by her father as the family escaped. The same bullet that hit her killed him. She still cries out for him. She has 5 other siblings, but in the confusion they were separated. Her desperate mother now can't find them.
I'm in a terrible situation right now. I'm really worried. I haven't got all my children together, and I've lost my husband. I've lost my house. Where do I go? There's only unhappiness for us.
Down the road at the larger central hospital, there are more casualties, crammed into a ward. People on the floor, people in corridors, every space taken. Half of these patients are Rohingya Muslims. This hospital has been inundated since the crisis started just over 2 weeks ago, and it's struggling to cope.
We need medicines, we need surgical equipments, we need manpower, we need associated staffs, everything.
And do you not have these?
No. Our government supply is limited.
The innocent can't comprehend what's happening to them. But the Rohingya people are suffering miserably in this conflict, whatever the Myanmar government says.
Almost 400,000 Rohingya Muslims have now fled across the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh since the latest upsurge in violence, which began at the end of August. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh, visiting one of the refugee camps, called on Myanmar to take the refugees back. The UN said yesterday that the treatment of the Rohingya by Myanmar, a mainly Buddhist country, amounted to ethnic cleansing. The UN is holding an urgent meeting tomorrow to discuss the crisis. Well, my colleague Rita Chakrabarti is at the Kutupalong refugee camp. She has the latest for us, and we can join Rita now.
Hugh, we're at the edge of this huge, sprawling camp in which people are enduring a really degraded existence, sleeping on tarpaulins on top of the monsoon mud. Aid has been slow to come, and with so many people packed into such miserable conditions, it has the potential to get much worse, as my colleague Justin Rolat now reports.
Rashida is 9 months pregnant. She is expecting any day. But this is where she's living with 15 other family members, and it is almost certainly where she'll have to give birth.
I'm worried. There is no help. Nobody's getting any food. Here there is no rice, no vegetables, nothing. I'm starving.
I first met her a few days back. She'd hiked for 7 days through the hills and jungle to get here. She says her village had been burnt to the ground. We've seen her and her family moved on by the authorities and driven off the land by fellow refugees. Many nights she's had to sleep under the skies despite the monsoon rain. Now her baby is sick and her husband has jaundice. And tens of thousands of other refugees are, like Rashida, living in these filthy makeshift cities that are mushrooming on the muddy hilltops here. They arrive bewildered. If they want a plastic sheet or bamboo to make a shelter, they pay. They often have to fight just to get food.
These guys are well-meaning Bangladeshis just trying to help out, but just look how chaotic this is. And it's so demeaning for these people to have to beg for food.
There is growing criticism of the way Bangladesh is handling this crisis.
We have to give them shelter so that they can live, they can get some food, medication.
All the big international aid agencies are here, but the government restricts what they can do. For example, the UN's main refugee body, the UNHCR, is not allowed to work with the vast majority of the refugees.
We're discussing with the government to see how we can provide assistance. What needs to happen next is for us to work closer together to make sure that land is allocated, that temporary shelter is provided, so that things can be a little more organized.
And while that discussion takes place, what these people really need is food and fresh water. Somewhere clean to live and sleep. Rashida needs medical care and a safe place to have her baby. What she and all the refugees need is a home. Justin Rolat, BBC News, TechNav.
Rita, last night you were at a hospital. Today, as we've seen at this refugee camp. Tell us a little more about the kind of range of needs, practical needs, that these people have there.
Well, Hugh, the conditions that people are living in are really pitiful. It's very uncomfortable and it's unsanitary. Clean water, access to clean water is a major problem. And with so many exhausted and malnourished people living in such close proximity to each other, the danger is that illness may spread. In one of these little shelters behind me, you can probably see a father who is tending to his little 4-year-old son. The son is running a fever. The little boy's older brother, who's 5, has been ill for 4 days. Now, there are several families living in that shelter, so you can see the danger. The visit of Bangladesh's Prime Minister today, though, to this camp may signal that the government is finally acknowledging that there is a crisis and that it has to get to grips with it. Given the situation in Myanmar, it's very unlikely that these refugees will be returning home anytime soon.
Rita, again, thank you very much. Rita Chakrabarti there for us with the latest in Bangladesh. World's fastest growing humanitarian crisis as thousands of Rohingya refugees are spending a fourth night stranded near the border with Bangladesh. Hundreds of thousands have left their homes in Myanmar, where they'd faced a military offensive following claims that Rohingya militants were guilty of attacking police checkpoints there. More than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims have now fled across the border into Bangladesh, and over the past 3 days, some 15,000 refugees have been stranded with limited supplies of food and water. Well, my colleague Clive Myrie is in the port of Cox's Bazar, and he sent this report.
In the distance in Myanmar, where Rohingya villages have burned in recent weeks and the people have been driven out, there's another fire. It's ethnic cleansing, says the UN. And the purged are fleeing for their lives into neighbouring Bangladesh.
In my village, many were killed, but my son had just been born, so we have only now been able to escape. We haven't had time to name him.
What's going on in Myanmar? Why have you had to flee? Another man we came across spoke of violence and murder.
On the way, we saw many dead people, their heads and limbs chopped off. The slaughter took place house by house.
As we drew closer to the border, nothing had prepared us for the full extent of the day's exodus. Almost as far as the eye could see, left and right, a tide of humanity. Between 10 and 15,000 people had crossed the border in one night. Young and old, hungry, exhausted, traumatized. And for the weak, it's a painful journey into exile, with the searing heat stinging the skin infection of this child beneath an unrelenting sun. They'd been hiding out for close to a week to avoid detection along the border. This, a first meal without having to watch their backs. A man makes a call to tell relatives he's made it, while others, parched and desperate, take their chance with the filthy water all around.
Well, as you can see, they're carrying with them whatever they could salvage from their villages, their homes that they say they were burnt out of by the Myanmar military. Look at that little baby there in a basket. And there's another one here on the other side. So many young children we're seeing here today. This has to be one of the biggest single-day influxes of refugees from across the border, just over there, in the whole of this crisis.
Many just don't have the strength to walk, including Minara Begum. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy just hours before crossing into Bangladesh. Born on a riverbank, he first opened his eyes to see a cruel world in which it seems there's no place for him or the other Rohingya Muslims. I begged God to save us, her husband Mohammed tells me. We hadn't eaten for 2 days and she went into labor. I don't know what will happen to my baby now. He's so fragile. The new arrivals could end up in one of these, the giant tented camps built in a matter of days on hillsides freshly stripped of trees. The largest will soon become the biggest refugee camp on earth.
I've seen a lot of these crises around the world, and I really wasn't quite prepared for the degree of suffering and despair. And yet these people are very resilient. They have not lost hope. They still think that they can make a life again in their home country. And it simply doubles our resolve to go back and find more resources for them until we can bring them home.
But some have died seeking sanctuary. This week, a boat carrying 60 Rohingya Muslims escaping Myanmar capsized. 14 perished, most of them children. For the Bangladeshis, the mass influx of so many refugees is difficult to control. After a delay, these Rohingya Muslims should begin moving to an established refugee camp in the coming days. The border remains open, but for those still wanting to escape Myanmar, the fear is that soon the gates could shut. Tens of thousands are already massing on the frontier, ready to make their dash for survival.
Good evening. Outcast and desperate and facing appalling dangers. The verdict of the UN Children's Agency UNICEF as it describes the living conditions being endured by hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims and in particular the 12,000 children who are now fleeing Myanmar for neighbouring Bangladesh every week. More than 500,000 refugees have left their homes in Myanmar where they'd faced a military offensive and been burned out of their homes following long-standing tensions and violence in the area. Clive Myrie reports from the Kutupalong refugee camp just over the Myanmar border in Bangladesh. You may find some of the images distressing.
Every breath is a struggle for Mohammed Ibrahim. 6 months old and fighting pneumonia. He's terribly weak and malnourished. He has just a 50-50 chance of seeing out another day. A sense of sorrow hangs heavy in the air in this clinic in Bangladesh. 80% of the patients are Rohingya Muslim refugees, and many are malnourished children, the weakest of the weak. The mother of 18-month-old Mostakima summed up the nightmare of so many Rohingya women.
We had to run from our village, but we had so little to eat. Then when we managed to get food, I couldn't feed my child. She's so sick, but if God wishes it, she'll survive.
Working with the local staff here is Ian Cross, a former GP from Leicester.
Tears come to my eyes sometimes. It's dreadful. You just do what you can, you know. In a way, I'm lucky that I'm a doctor. I've got my hands and my tools. I can help to make people better. If I wasn't able to do that, I'd feel so frustrated and I'd feel even worse. But when you're hard at work, you can cope with it.
It is a depressing truth in this crisis that close to 60% of the more than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims who've escaped Myanmar are children and teenagers. And they've seen some terrible things, like Havaja Khatun. She's called this refugee camp in Bangladesh home for almost 2 weeks. Her story of the night she had to flee Myanmar is depressingly familiar. Villages torched and her mother dying in the flames. They're killing all the Muslims, she told me, slaughtering innocent Rohingyas. We've always been treated as lesser people in our own land. Now they want to finish us off. But dangers lurk in exile too. Young women like Havaja are vulnerable. And the chance of children falling into the hands of sexual predators or exploited for their labor is ever present.
The families here have nothing. They are trying to survive on a daily basis. And some of them, at some points, might be tempted to give away one of their child for domestic work. You know, not going to school, sometimes sexual abuse. So the risks are high.
But there is light amidst all the gloom. Children in the camps are getting vaccinated against cholera and other diseases. There's even a chance to watch cartoons. And youngsters are never allowed to feel ashamed of who they are. In this class, they're reciting nursery rhymes from their homeland. Outside one refugee camp, we found by the side of the road Mimuna, who's 9, cradling her younger brother Abu. Too young to understand the bundle in her arms was severely malnourished, we alerted UNICEF, and doctors are now treating them both. But some will never have the chance to return to Myanmar. The day after we filmed Mohammed Ibrahim, we were told he died. He was buried in a tiny grave before sundown.
The United Nations says the world community must pledge more money to help hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims who fled violence in Myanmar and sought sanctuary in neighbouring Bangladesh. There were around 300,000 refugees inside camps along the border around August. Since then, another 600,000 have arrived, and the number of refugees could soon reach 1 million, putting the aid agencies and indeed the Bangladeshi authorities under immense pressure. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, has been accused of ethnic cleansing amid fears that the refugees could spend decades in this state of uncertainty. From one of the camps in Bangladesh, my colleague Clive Myrie has sent this report.
For Rohingya Muslims who've escaped Myanmar, neighbouring Bangladesh is a land of second chances. These refugees, part of a huge influx we saw across the border, are queuing for their first food supplies. With their pink ration cards, they're now dependent on the kindness of strangers. It can be a long, tiring wait in the clammy, humid air. Best do what you can to make things a little bearable. These Rohingyas are the latest in a long line of victims of a sectarian and religious conflict that stretches back many decades.
This is a crisis that's been going on a long time. You guys must be feeding people who have probably sort of been through this, crossed the border many years ago.
That's true. We've been feeding for 25 years. You can see it in the camps. At the bottom of the camp, there's refugees from 25 years ago. You move upwards, 10 years ago, 1 year ago, and now you can see who's arrived yesterday.
These guys arrived this week?
It's incredible.
For the refugees, this might be the land of second chances, but it seemed one Rohingya Muslim's luck had run out. A few days ago, we found Abu in the arms of his big sister Mimuna by the side of a road. Limp and lifeless, acutely malnourished, we alerted UNICEF.
Maimuna.
After several days in the clinic, Abu's back from the brink. He was terribly sick with fever and diarrhea. It was a close call.
So the doctors say that he was malnourished, still is malnourished, but he is taking in food, which means that hopefully in a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, he should be eating normally and, fingers crossed, gaining weight.
But will Abu and his big sister ever see the land of their birth again? Just how long is this period of exile for the hundreds of thousands here? The future of the refugees is being discussed at the highest levels between the Bangladesh and Myanmar governments. Could the Rohingyas one day return home and these camps close? Well, no one's holding their breath. At the UN General Assembly, Bangladesh's Prime Minister made it clear where she thinks the blame for the crisis lies.
This forcibly displaced people of Myanmar are fleeing an ethnic cleansing in their own country where they have been living for centuries.
It's a charge Myanmar strongly denies, blaming Rohingya insurgents for attacks on civilians. The funeral procession of Rashida Mohammed makes its way through a Rohingya refugee camp. He was 75 and never saw Muslim and Buddhist reconcile in his homeland. A younger generation may one day see this happen, but for now, many Rohingya will live and die on foreign soil. Clive Myrie, BBC News in Bangladesh.
The UN says the leaders of Myanmar could face charges of genocide over the persecution of Rohingya Muslims. It's estimated more than 650,000 have fled into neighbouring Bangladesh since August, escaping a military crackdown and militia violence. Myanmar's army says it's only been targeting Rohingya militants. Our South Asia correspondent Justin Rolat has sent us this report.
Munjor Ali is 11 years old. He draws pictures of the horrors he's witnessed.
Older women were stamped on, and then the military grabbed them by the hair and slaughtered them. Because I saw that, I'm drawing this.
He's one of 650,000 Rohingya refugees who fled Myanmar after a military assault that began in late August. They're coming to kill us, says the man. They're coming to kill us. The widespread and systematic nature of the violence has persuaded the UN's human rights chief that the crimes committed in Myanmar could amount to genocide, acts intended to destroy a group of people.
Can anyone rule out that elements of genocide may be present?
He wants a criminal investigation to identify the perpetrators, and in an exclusive interview with the BBC, he doesn't rule out the possibility that Aung San Suu Kyi or military leaders could end up in the dock.
Given the scale of the military operation, clearly these would have to be decisions taken at a high enough level. And then there's the crime of omission, that if it came to your knowledge that this was being committed and you did nothing to stop it, then you could be culpable as well for that.
He says only a court can judge that, but he is determined that justice should be done. In the meantime, though, Monjor Ali and hundreds of thousands like him remain in limbo. We asked Aung San Suu Kyi for a response, but she hasn't replied. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
A parliamentary committee has expressed grave concern about plans to begin repatriating hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims from Bangladesh back to Myanmar, from where they fled the violence last year. The International Development Committee has warned that rape and sexual violence are still weapons of war used by the military in Myanmar. Around 570,000 Rohingyas are now living in the world's largest refugee camp, Kutupalong, near the port city of Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. My colleague Michelle Hussain is in Kutupalong with the latest now.
Hugh, it was a mass movement of people unmatched in recent years that created this refugee camp in the space of just 5 months. And today, the entire landscape in this part of southeastern Bangladesh is dotted with small shelters like these, from here right up to the border with Myanmar, a few miles away. Living conditions for the refugees are very difficult, but at the same time, for most of them, the idea of returning to Myanmar at the moment is unthinkable. They say their security would need to be guaranteed first. In a camp where hundreds of refugees are still arriving every week, there's much to be done. New wells, new shelters, all part of providing for growing numbers and preparing the camp for the monsoon rains. The more construction and expansion that takes place at this vast camp, the more permanent it starts to feel. But at the same time, the talk of repatriating the refugees is causing deep alarm. After the circumstances in which they fled Myanmar less than 6 months ago, who would really trust that things had changed enough for them to go home? That's because the destruction of their homes and villages continued even after Myanmar said military operations had come to an end. These pictures were filmed by the BBC from the Bangladeshi side of the border on the 10th of September last year, 5 days after the supposed ceasefire. This was your house?
This is my house.
That was also the day Irfan lost everything. A father of 4, he was a secondary school teacher back in Myanmar and lived here with his extended family. And then who's that?
He is my brother.
The authorities told them they'd be safe, and then the soldiers came.
The military surrounded the whole area and they had weapons. They opened fire as people were trying to leave. Some escaped, but others were killed. My brother was at home that day, but he went out to check on his shop. He never came back. We don't know if he was burned alive. We still haven't heard anything.
Away from the main camp, another area is home to Hindus from Myanmar who were caught up in the violence. They've been identified as among the first to be repatriated, but even they are not ready to go without international protection.
If the United Nations goes with us, the Hindus, we hope we'll get security and be happy. If they are there and we face any problem, the whole world will know about it.
For now, it seems most likely that the children of these camps will grow up here without a country to call their own. The UN's access to their old home, Rakhine State, is severely restricted. They too call for change and for the Rohingya to be properly recognised.
At this stage, I think it's premature to talk about returns in large numbers until three conditions exist. Number one, the issue of citizenship and legal identity must be addressed. Number two, there has to be a safe and secure environment for refugees to return to. And number three, reconstruction and the reestablishment of services must occur.
Services here are now more organised, but it's a precarious existence. A community who've been marginalised and persecuted are now entirely dependent on aid and on what others decide for their future.
Well, the aid agency UNICEF is calling this a children's crisis because of the large numbers of children who live here in the camps. It's also voicing concern about 25,000 refugee babies who it says will be born in the camps this year and who will lack any legal papers. Our South Asia correspondent Justin Rolat met one Rohingya woman last September who crossed the border just before giving birth here in Bangladesh. And he's been back to see her and find out how she and her new baby are doing.
Hey, hello, Rashida Bachaka. Where's the child? And his name is Mohammed, yes?
Mohammed is 3.5 months old now.
Hello, Mohammed. Hello. Salam alaikum.
But right from birth, he's faced discrimination.
Can I pick him up, Rashida?
The Bangladeshi authorities won't issue birth certificates to Rohingya babies, so officially, Mohammed does not exist.
He's blowing bubbles. Ooh.
We first met his mother the day she escaped from Myanmar. She was 9 months pregnant. She told me how the Myanmar army and local Buddhists had attacked her village. But their troubles were far from over. Guards moved her and her family on. They said there was land over the hill, but not enough for everyone. Rashida's husband tried to stake out a plot, but was driven off by other refugees. Her family had to sleep in the open despite the rains. Finally, they found space to build a rickety shack. Sufait was born on the soggy mud floor.
He was born right here. There was no midwife, no medicine, no mat, no wood to light a fire. It was so painful. But by God's grace, a girl from next door came and cut the umbilical cord. Then I picked him up from the mud. That's how my baby came into this world.
Luckily, Mohammed hasn't caught cholera or diphtheria, two of the deadly diseases that have broken out in the camps. But not having any official identity will be a real problem. It'll be hard for him to get into school, to register for services, and may make getting back into Myanmar even more difficult for his family. So, like the rest of the refugees, he'll have to eke out an existence here in Bangladesh, stateless, with just a shack for a home, denied even the dignity of an official identity. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Kutupalong.
There were talks between Bangladesh and Myanmar today about beginning the process of the Rohingyas returning to Myanmar. But those talks are hard to reconcile with the fact that the refugees are still crossing the border and arriving here in Bangladesh, and they say that violence against them in Myanmar is continuing. Some of those I met here are resigned to spending the rest of their lives in these camps. Others say that if their rights in Myanmar are guaranteed, they will go home. Hugh.
Michelle, once again, thank you very much. Michelle Hussain there with the latest from the refugee camp in Kutupalong.